so you're probably, you don't kill babies.
Yeah.
But that was the other interesting thing when your aunt went to kindergarten. Her kindergarten teacher said to her that all military men were warmongers and they would kill babies. And that wasn't the case at all. And when we went to a change of command on one of the old sailing ships in Boston Harbor, we were told all to wear our uniforms. And during that time, somebody spit on your grandfather because he was in uniform. And we got to hear a man who was retiring, and he made a very important speech that I'll always remember about no one ever accuses a fireman of advocating fire or a policeman of advocating crime, but they readily point to a military man who's willing to put his life on the line for freedom and say he's a warmonger.
Yeah. Wow. Do you remember anything about the presidential candidate election in 1968?
You mean when Nixon?
Yes.
When Nixon became president?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, at that time I was a Republican, so I did not vote for Nixon.
Really?
No. I voted for Kennedy in the first election, and then I probably would not have voted for him the second time around.
Okay.
But since then, the Republican Party has disappointed me so many times that when Barack Obama ran for president, I became a Democrat. My father would probably rise up from his grave if he knew that and cheer me because he was always a card-carrying, pro-labor, pro-union Democrat, and he thought his only contribution to the world was to take his 5 daughters down when we turned 18 and register us as Democrats, which was interesting.
Yeah. Let me ask you about music. How was music a big part of your life? Did you really like music or not?
Well, I loved musicals, and I actually liked semi-classical music, but my generation was, the generation that was the Beatles, rock and roll, jazz, really good jazz, I guess, but I did the fraternity rounds, and, you heard that kind of music, but I wasn't much into that. The arts at that time, there was a large explosion of Picasso and Miro and expressionist type art.
Yeah.
Which I have never been liked at all. I liked realism, so I guess I was sort of out of touch with my generation because everybody bought into that.
Yeah. Okay. Can I ask you, as a young adult, did you ever take part in any type of activism, either for civil rights or for women's rights?
No, not at all.
Really?
Yeah, no, because I've always been a very practical person, and I always think that change can happen, in the nucleus of your life. You make a difference in people's lives. You take an opportunity to help people when you can.
Yeah.
And you don't, but I sort of resented the fact that there were a lot of Catholic nuns and priests that went down to Washington and, threw blood on the Capitol. I thought that was an inappropriate response, and I thought that they were representing themselves as part of the church, and they really weren't.
Yeah.
And I've always thought that, that isn't the way that I could make a difference. I had to get educated and try to make a change. And as I told your grandfather one time, you need to keep your mouth shut until you're promoted far enough that you can make a difference. And he actually listened to me. That's the funny part.
May I ask where you were when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated?
We were stationed in Washington at the time, so I remember it, but it was, once again, as a military person, you lived in a totally integrated society.
Yeah.
And as the son of an Irish laborer, I never thought of myself as better than anybody,
Yeah.
So I wasn't, that didn't affect me in that way. I'm sure it's interesting for me and as a perspective sometimes look at some of our friends who are, doctors that are black people, and a lot of the physicians today that, Al has to deal with come from third world countries.
Yeah.
And so I've never been much into, segregation of any kind.
I got you. One more question. Can you describe for me in your own words what you thought the 60s was? How would you best describe the 1960s?
I think that the 60s, it was still a wonderful time to live because people had very defined roles. There were comfort places. There were expectations of fathers that they would have a job and support a family. Their role in the family was revered.
Yeah.
The wife also had, a place in the family, and then all of a sudden in the 60s, the female movement, they didn't really know what direction they were taking in.
Mm-hmm.
They took us on a path that I'm not quite sure has been defined, because the women of the 60s were, certainly not prepared.
Yeah.
I don't think, to be on their own.
Yeah.
But now we had to be mothers, we had to be wives, we had to be working people, we had to be all of those things.
Yeah.
And anybody will tell you can do maybe 3 out of 4 of those things, but not 4 of them successfully.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It was nice talking.